Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today, and welcome to the second webinar in the Clean Energy on Mineland webinar series. Today, we'll be focusing on NEPA considerations for siting clean energy on Mineland. I'm Jillian Romstall, a project manager in OCEED's Mineland program, and I will be kicking us off today. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded today. If you would not like to be recorded, please keep your video off and stay on mute. The chat has been disabled and all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions, please send them directly to me and we will do our best to answer them. I have renamed myself as Ask Me in the chat panel to make this easier. So again, if you have any questions, just send them directly to me for the panelist questions. Next slide, please. Today, we'll start off with a brief introduction of DOE's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or OCEED for short, and its Mineland program. After that, we'll pivot to the primary bulk of the presentation that will focus on NEPA considerations for clean energy on Mineland, starting with an overview of NEPA, followed by NEPA requirements for OCEED, and then requirements for DOI's Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, or OSMRE. And after that, we will have some time for Q&A. Next slide, please. And I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers today, which will include Gretchen Applegate, who is a NEPA specialist for OCEED, and Logan Scholler, who is a natural resource specialist at OSMRE. Next slide, please. But before I hand it over to our speakers today, I did want to provide a brief overview of the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations and its Mineland program. Next slide. OCEED's mission is to deliver clean energy technology demonstration projects at scale in partnership with the private sector to accelerate deployment, market adoption, and the equitable transition to a decarbonized energy system. Next slide, please. We are a relatively new organization funded out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. We have a little over $25 billion in programming, and this slide lists off some of those programs. One of those programs is, of course, the Clean Energy Demonstration Program on current and former Mineland, which is running this webinar series, and I will go into a few more details about this program in just a minute. But really what drives us here at OCEED, our mandate falls into 5 categories. One is being a center of excellence, really serving as a primary office to deliver full-scale clean energy demonstration projects and project management oversight. Second is clean energy and equitability, helping to enable 100% clean electricity by 2035 and net zero emissions by 2050 through an equitable clean energy transition. 3, we're always thinking about follow-on investment. So unlocking and scaling trillion-dollar clean energy follow-on investment by the private sector and other areas of capital. 4 is to de-risk technology by maintaining a risk-based, balanced, and defensible portfolio of investments. And the last mandate is ongoing engagement and outreach. We want to leverage the learnings and experiences of the private sector, broader ecosystems, and communities themselves to really understand how we can collaborate, get feedback, and partner together to reach our shared goals. Next slide. And now I'll provide a brief overview of the Clean Energy Demonstration Program on current and former Mineland, or CEML for short. Next slide. The CEML program received $500 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law and will provide financial investment, technical assistance, and other resources to advance the widespread deployment of clean energy projects on current and former Mineland. Through this program, up to 5 clean energy projects will be carried out in geographically diverse regions, at least 2 of which must be solar projects. These demonstration projects are expected to be replicable, providing knowledge and experience that catalyze the next generation of clean energy on Mineland projects. This program also aims to support the economic revitalization of former coal communities and disadvantaged areas and demonstrate opportunities to achieve net zero mining operations. Next slide. Through this program, we are currently offering no-cost technical assistance to support the development of clean energy projects on Mineland. Technical assistance could include support with high-level technology, top technology or site readiness considerations, support navigating the permitting and interconnection process, community engagement support, and more. Technical assistance will vary based on specific project needs and requests and intends to support any phase of project development, including concept development, planning, design, or execution. If you are interested in technical assistance, I encourage you to visit our webpage to learn more and apply. I will drop the link in the chat in just a minute. And now I'll kick it over to Gretchen Applegate, who is our NEPA specialist in OCEED and will be presenting on NEPA. Over to you, Gretchen.
Great, thank you, Jillian. Next slide, please. So my name is Gretchen Applegate, and I am a NEPA specialist in the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. And I'll be talking to you all today about NEPA's regulatory framework, NEPA Fundamentals, major federal actions under NEPA, other federal agency requirements, and we will also be hearing from Logan Scholler from the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement on their agency's NEPA requirements. Next slide, please. So NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, was signed into law on January 1st, 1970, and it set forth a national policy, quoting directly from the regulations, to use all practicable means and measures, including financial and technical assistance, in a manner calculated to foster and promote the general welfare, to create and maintain conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony, and fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations of Americans. The overall purpose of NEPA is to assure that all branches of the federal government give proper consideration to the environment prior to undertaking any major federal action that could significantly affect the environment. A second significant purpose of NEPA is to ensure agencies inform the public about what the action is and that the agency has considered environmental concerns in its decision-making process. NEPA has become one of the primary mechanisms through which the public is able to participate in the federal decision-making process. Next slide, please. NEPA also established the Council on Environmental Quality. CEQ is within the Executive Office of the President. They established the regulations for implementing the procedural provisions of NEPA found in 40 CFR parts 1500 through 1508. Essentially, CEQ established how NEPA would work in practice. And of particular importance, with the recent emphasis on both the expedience of the NEPA and permitting processes and meaningful community engagement, CEQ works with federal agencies and stakeholders to ensure that environmental reviews for projects and federal actions are thorough, efficient, and reflect the input of the public and local communities. Next slide, please. CEQ's NEPA regulations also direct each federal agency to establish their own implementing procedures. It is DOE's policy to follow the letter and spirit of NEPA, comply fully with the CEQ regulations, and apply the NEPA review process early in the planning stages for DOE proposals. DOE's NEPA regulations unambiguously apply to financial assistance, whereby DOE makes awards of financial assistance to an applicant either through a grant or cooperative agreement to help support or stimulate a project. Throughout DOE's NEPA regulations, there is an emphasis on early integration with project planning and decision-making. The earlier DOE can be involved in the project planning, and especially the review and gathering of necessary information, the better. The regulations define categories of actions that have been determined to not have the potential to significantly impact the environment. These are called categorical exclusions. The regulations also define categories of actions that typically require the completion of an environmental assessment, and those actions that typically require the completion of an environmental impact statement. DOE's NEPA regulations also require meaningful engagement with tribal governments, as well as the public and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. As was mentioned previously, financial assistance is considered a major federal action subject to NEPA review. The CEQ regulations state that major federal actions may include new and continuing activities, including projects and programs entirely or partly financed, assisted, conducted, regulated, or approved by federal agencies. Financial assistance is also considered a federal undertaking per the National Historic Preservation Act and would also require compliance with the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, Clean Water Act, etc. We discussed here in a bit how NEPA works as an umbrella statute. A lot of these consultations need to be completed in parallel as they inform the conclusions of the NEPA review. It's important to note that any project activities cannot begin until DOE has completed NEPA and the associated consultation requirements. DOE's regulatory responsibilities begin with DOE's selection of projects for negotiation of an award of financial assistance. Next slide, please. So NEPA specifically requires analysis of potential impacts to the human environment. So what does impacts to the human environment even mean? Meaning what impacts are analyzed and presented in NEPA documents. Effects or impacts mean changes to the human environment from the proposed action or alternatives that are reasonably foreseeable and include the following. Direct effects, which are caused by the action and occur at the same time and place. Indirect effects, which are caused by the action and are later in time or farther removed in distance, but are still reasonably foreseeable. Cumulative effects, which are effects on the environment that result from the incremental effects of the action when added to the effects of other past, present, and reasonably foreseeable actions, regardless of what agency, federal or non-federal, or person undertakes such other actions. Cumulative effects can result from individually minor, but collectively significant actions taking place over a period of time. Human environment means comprehensively the natural and physical environment and the relationship of present and future generations with that environment. So not just the environment, but our collective relationship to the environment. Effects to the human environment include ecological, aesthetic, historic, cultural, economic, social, and/or human health impacts. This is particularly important as there is a common misperception that NEPA considers only impacts to ecology. However, NEPA considers direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts to not only ecological resources like air, water, and wildlife, but also aesthetics or visual impacts, impacts to historic properties and cultural resources, socioeconomics, environmental justice, and health and human safety. And NEPA documents include analysis of both beneficial and adverse impacts. So what does reasonably foreseeable mean? For our purposes today, it might actually be easier to define what isn't reasonably foreseeable. So future actions that are not grounded in planning documents, specific proposals, or regional or local plans would typically be considered too remote and too speculative and thus not reasonably foreseeable and not analyzed in the NEPA document. Next slide, please. The current NEPA regulations do not provide a definition of significance. Agencies typically determine significance by considering both context and intensity. Context is the geographic, biophysical, and social context in which the effects will occur, such as society as a whole, a region, or a local area. Intensity refers to the severity or the extent of the impact in whatever context it occurs. So the interplay between context and intensity helps DOE to determine if an impact would be considered significant. An example, a project would adversely impact 1 acre of salamander habitat. Now, it would be significant if it was the last acre of habitat in the region, but it may not be necessarily significant if there were millions of acres of habitat available. Next slide, please.
Okay.
There are 3 levels of NEPA review: the categorical exclusion or CADX or CX, the environmental assessment or EA, and the environmental impact statement or EIS. Next slide, please. Categorical exclusions are classes of actions that do not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the human environment. DOE's NEPA regulations include CXs that apply to actions ranging from administrative activities to R&D and limited scale energy deployment projects. These can be found in appendices A and B of DOE's NEPA implementing regulations. So what does DOE consider when applying a CX? To answer the question of, is there an applicable CX that adequately covers the proposed action? Then we need to ask, are there any extraordinary circumstances that would apply? Extraordinary circumstances include unique situations presented by specific proposals, including, but not limited to, scientific controversy about the environmental effects of the proposal, uncertain effects or effects involving unique or unknown risks, and unresolved conflicts concerning alternative uses of available resources. And DOE needs to confirm that the proposal has not been segmented or broken into smaller parts to avoid the appearance of significance of the total action. If it is determined that a proposed action meets the requirements of a categorical exclusion and that extraordinary circumstances do not apply, DOE would prepare a CX. Now, a CX is not an exemption from NEPA. A CX is the lowest level of NEPA review and represents only an exclusion from additional review via an EA or an EIS. CXs typically take only a few weeks for DOE to prepare unless consultation with another federal agency is required. DOE requires CXs to be posted for public review within 2 weeks of their completion on DOE's Office of NEPA Policy and Compliance website. Next slide, please. An EA is required for proposed actions that are not categorically excludable, but are also not likely to have significant effects, or when the significance of the effects is unknown. An EA is a concise public document. EAs are required to be 75 pages or less. An EA shall provide sufficient evidence and analysis for determining whether to prepare an environmental impact statement or a finding of no significant impact. And the agencies and federal agencies are required to complete EAs within 1 year. Typically, the determination by DOE to complete an EA starts the clock, and a FONSI is the finish line. The goal of these requirements is to help ensure that agencies conduct NEPA as efficiently and expeditiously as possible. Next slide. Here you can see a visual representation of those public participation points for an EA. It begins with the determination by DOE that an EA is required, which, as mentioned earlier, starts our NEPA clock. Then a scoping period where agencies ask the public, tribes, state and local governments, and relevant agencies to weigh in on the scope of the analysis in the EA. While it is not required for an EA, it is frequently part of the process and is considered a best practice by DOE. Typically, the scoping period is anywhere from 14 to 30 days. Then DOE would provide the draft EA to the identified stakeholders for review and comment. Again, the review period is typically between 14 and 30 days, and while not required, it is considered a best practice by DOE. DOE then considers all comments received during the review period before approving or modifying the EA as appropriate. Next slide. An EIS is required when a proposed action would have significant effects on the human environment. An agency can determine an EIS is required based on the proposal itself or based on the completion of an EA. EISs are not supposed to be encyclopedic. Rather, they should be analytic and concise and no longer than necessary. EISs are required to be 150 pages or less, or 300 pages or less for those proposals of unusual scope or complexity. EISs and EAs should discuss impacts of the project in proportion to their significance. Now, the regulations are fairly specific when it comes to the content and format of an EIS, and this is to encourage good analysis and a clear presentation of alternatives. Federal agencies are required to complete EISs within 2 years. Next slide. Here you'll see a visual representation. Thank you. Here you'll see a visual representation of those public participation points for an EIS. An EIS begins with the publication of a notice of intent, or NOI, in the Federal Register. The NOI states that DOE has determined an EIS is required, opens a 30-day public scoping period, and announces the dates of public meetings. The publication of the draft EIS initiates a 45-day public review and comment period with at least one public meeting. After the final EIS is published, DOE must wait at least 30 days before making a decision on actions proposed in the EIS. If DOE decides to take action on a proposal, a record of decision is prepared and published in the Federal Register. Next slide. As mentioned earlier, NEPA is considered an umbrella statute. So large, complex actions such as bridge and highway construction, mining operations, and clean energy demonstration projects may require compliance with literally dozens of federal, state, tribal, and local laws. Most agencies, including DOE, use NEPA as an umbrella statute, whereby NEPA provides a framework to coordinate or demonstrate compliance with any studies, reviews, or consultations required by other environmental laws. To integrate the compliance process and avoid duplication of effort, NEPA regulations specify that to the fullest extent possible, agencies must prepare the NEPA document concurrently with other environmental requirements. The NEPA document should list any federal permits, licenses, and other entitlements required to implement the proposed project. Now, the need to comply with another environmental law, such as the Clean Water Act or Endangered Species Act, while it may be identified within the framework of the NEPA process, NEPA itself is not the source of the obligation nor the process to comply. Just because you complete a NEPA document doesn't mean you've complied with ESA. So you still have to go through consultation process with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. So information produced for the NEPA document can inform the ESA consultation and vice versa. And typically the consultation conclusions are presented in the final NEPA document. Next slide, please. Federal or state agencies will have specific regulations on what to expect in terms of clean energy projects on mine lands under their jurisdiction and within their area of expertise. And these may be different by mine type or location. So here we've provided a snapshot of some federal agencies that may have a role in the NEPA review or permitting processes as it relates to mine lands. So BLM, Forest Service, MSHA, EPA, OSMRE. There would also be state, local, and tribal agencies that may have specific regulations that would need to be complied with for your project. Now, OCEED can't speak to all of the other agency requirements. However, we have invited someone from the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement to share their agency's NEPA requirements, which will hopefully provide further insight into how OCEED and other federal agencies will be working together in the NEPA review process. So with that, I will turn it over to Logan Scholler. Logan?
All right. Thanks, Gretchen. Hi, everybody. I'm Logan Scholler with the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement. I'm a NEPA project manager there. So I'm going to walk through how NEPA is generally applied to coal mining actions. And first, I'll give some background about the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act so folks can understand how things are organized for federal oversight of coal mining. We can go ahead and show that next slide. All right. So SMCRA, Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, was passed in 1977 in response to environmental damages resulting from coal mining, like acid mine drainage, which at that time had reached critical mass and gained increasing levels of public awareness. So the purpose of SMCRA is to regulate coal mining in an environmentally protective manner, which includes reclamation of the mining operation once it has ended. There are two main programs under SMCRA, Title IV and Title V. The Title IV program is focused on reclamation of abandoned mine lands that were mined prior to the creation of SMCRA. The Title V program is focused on protecting the environment from active mining operations. Many states where coal mining occurs have been delegated the authority to implement SMCRA through a state coal program via a cooperative agreement between OSMRE and the state. And here on the slide, you can see there are links to kind of the chronology of how SMCRA became to be. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement, or OSMRE, as an agency within the Department of the Interior and was created to implement SMCRA. OSMRE is the regulatory authority that issues SMCRA permits for states and tribes that don't have their own coal program with delegated SMCRA authority. And OSMRE oversees state coal programs that have been delegated authority to issue SMCRA permits through on-site inspections and the federal mine plan process. And then 30 CFR 740 through 746 describes the requirements of SMCRA, which includes protection of the environment during mining and reclamation of lands post-mining. OSMRE is also responsible for the reclamation of abandoned mine lands and works with state and tribal AML programs to implement the reclamation work. Next slide, please. Okay, so NEPA is required as part of the implementation of SMCRA by OSMRE. If OSMRE is the regulatory authority for a coal mine action, the NEPA analysis is required to support the SMCRA permit and the decision on the federal mine plan. However, if OSMRE is not the regulatory authority for the action, since the state or tribe has been delegated that authority, then the NEPA analysis is used to support the decision on the federal mine plan, which OSMRE still has to get approval on once the state or tribe has issued the actual SMCRA permit. And then AML projects, abandoned mine land projects, require a NEPA analysis before the reclamation work can begin as well. So Appendix 4.2 of the OSMRE NEPA handbook, which can be accessed on the webpage linked at the bottom of the slide here, consists of flowcharts for all OSMRE processes that show where and when NEPA is required. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have just kind of an outline of what can be expected when conducting NEPA with OSMRE. All of the basic rules of NEPA apply that Gretchen just went through. But to reiterate, multiple state and federal agencies may or may not have jurisdiction over the different resources in the environment. So multiple permitting actions could be required, as well as the consultations that Gretchen spoke to under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act or Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. And then just to reiterate here, for OSMRE, an EA can be, anywhere from 6 months to 1 year, and an EIS has a 2-year requirement, so we work to that end as far as preparing that NEPA document. And something to note for OSMRE is that, and probably in a similar way with other agencies, but all of our NEPA documents undergo review by agency solicitors. And, that can tend to add time to the project. So for actions that require an EIS under NEPA, just a heads up that OSMRE it may or may not be required to prepare briefings on the NEPA analysis in that EIS for the Secretary of the Department of the Interior. And that necessitates multiple levels of surnaming and review of the NEPA analysis to a fairly high level. So something to be considered there. And then as far as other notable items, I kind of wanted to point out that for projects like this that may be proposed for reclaimed mine land, generally during reclamation there may still be an active permit on that mine land, and so there will be a designated post-mine land use, and if the post-mine land use needs to be changed to accommodate a different use, it does require revising the SMCRA permit, modifying the federal mine plan, which would require a NEPA analysis for the modification of the federal mine plan. So, and I think that's all I have today. Move on to the last slides here. Okay, no, I lied. I do have one more slide. Thanks for that, Gail. These are other items to consider. OSMRE is a fairly small agency. We outsource a lot of our NEPA work with third-party contractors, so that will need to be a consideration. Again, we have briefings for all stages of NEPA public involvement with the Secretary's Office of the Department of Interior. And, also just to understand that state coal programs that are delegated SMCRA authority may also kind of be working with limited resources and staff. And I think this is kind of common sense in a lot of ways, especially when you talk about NEPA, but, trying to understand from the project perspective, who needs to be involved as early as possible is, can't really be overstated. And then obviously, if you can avoid the federal nexus, that, makes NEPA a requirement, that could save you a lot of time. Projects that occur on mines that are entirely private surface and private mineral, may decrease federal involvement. And, projects may be done more efficiently in that way. And I think I saw that there was technical assistance for proposals and things like that. And I would highly recommend, the more defined a proposal can be, and the least amount of changes made to those proposals once they're submitted really increase the chances of an efficient project. So do the next slide. Okay.
All right, thank you, Logan. So to summarize, the overall purpose of NEPA is to assure that all branches of the federal government give proper consideration to the environment prior to undertaking any major federal action, which includes financial assistance, that could significantly affect the environment. Another primary purpose of NEPA is to engage and inform the public and to work closely with other agencies and tribes. DOE will coordinate closely with other federal, state, local agencies and tribes to ensure that we, to the fullest extent possible, eliminate any duplicative reviews and try to complete one NEPA document that satisfies all agency requirements. It's important to remember that NEPA is a process. We must always follow the NEPA process, which will help to ensure that DOE makes better decisions. So thank you all for your time today. I will turn it over to Gail to see if we have any questions we can answer here today. Gail?
Yeah, thanks, Gretchen. And Logan, thanks so much for your informative presentations. Really enjoyed hearing what you had to say. I've got some questions that we have found are pretty regular questions that we receive. So we thought that this would be a good time to address them. And I'll go ahead and start with the first question, which we receive with these webinars is, will we receive a copy of the presentation?
Yes, a copy of the presentation will be posted to OCEED's website following this webinar.
Great, thank you. And then will there be another NEPA webinar?
So there is not another NEPA webinar scheduled at this time, but as was mentioned, you can utilize the CEML TA program to help answer NEPA related questions, or check back on OCEED's website for a copy of the presentation. You can also visit www.energy.gov/NEPA to access DOE's NEPA resources.
Great. Can we contact Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations to ask specific questions about our project?
Sure. So at this time, OCEED cannot provide answers on specific CEML project application questions. So I would encourage you to review the DOE's NEPA implementing regulations, or you can use the CEML TA program.
Great. Another question, how will I know if other federal agencies are involved in the NEPA process?
So DOE, as the lead federal agency, would be required to consult with other federal, state, local, and tribal agencies who have jurisdiction or special expertise related to your project. So the agencies involved in a project will depend on the type of project you have, its location, its overall design. So DOE will make that determination if any other agencies need to be identified as cooperating or participating agencies in accordance with CEQ and DOE's NEPA implementing regulations.
Great. And then another how will I know question is, how will I know if my project fits in a categorical exclusion, environmental assessment, or environmental impact statement?
Great question. So that determination is made by the DOE, and again, will depend on the specifics of your project. There is a list of projects and their typical level of NEPA review in DOE's NEPA implementing regulations, which is 10 CFR 1021. It's also found on energy.gov/NEPA, which you could take a look at as you prepare your application. But keep in mind that it is at the agency's discretion as to which level of NEPA applies, and certain extraordinary circumstances may mean that your project requires a higher level of NEPA review.
Okay, good to know. And Gretchen, when will the public be able to comment on the proposed projects?
So public participation is an integral part of NEPA's procedural requirements, and the level of public involvement will again depend on your specific project and the level of NEPA review being completed. So for instance, for an EIS, an environmental impact statement, the first opportunity for the public to provide input would be after the release of the notice of intent to prepare an EIS and initiation of the 30-day public scoping period, which there will also be at least one public meeting held during that time frame.
Okay, that's helpful. And then a FAST 41 question, would my project qualify under FAST 41?
So FAST 41, or the FAST Act, Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, that was signed into law back in 2015. And Title 41 of that act, which is referred to as FAST 41, that created a new governance structure, set of procedures, and funding authorities to help improve the federal environmental review and authorization process for covered infrastructure projects. Project sponsors are responsible for submitting information to the Infrastructure Steering Committee to be considered a FAST 41 covered project. DOE would not be submitting projects under FAST 41. So if you're interested in that process, I'd encourage you to go on and learn more about it.
Okay, great. And then where can we find DOE's NEPA implementing regulations?
So you can find our implementing regulations on our website, www.energy.gov/NEPA, or directly in the regulations at 10 CFR 1021.
Great. And then Gretchen, for an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, do the page limits include appendices?
No, the page limits for EAs and EISs do not include appendices, and they also do not include graphics. So things like tables or figures or.
Great. And then what would cause an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement to go beyond the time limit?
Although the CEQ regulations have imposed time limits for the completion of EAs and EISs, those NEPA clocks can be stopped and started or paused in the event that the project is either missing critical data or a significant issue has arisen during consultations.
Okay, good to know. And then is there a categorical exclusion for solar projects?
Yes. However, your project would need to meet all of the criteria to fit within that categorical exclusion. You can find DOE's categorical exclusions in appendices A and B of DOE's NEPA implementing regulations. For that specific categorical exclusion, it would be B5.116, B5.16 for solar photovoltaic systems. And I'll just read directly here from our regulations. So an action can be categorically excluded if the installation, modification, operation, and removal of commercially available solar photovoltaic systems located on a building or other structure, such as a parking lot, or if located on land generally comprising less than 10 acres of previously disturbed or developed area. Covered actions would be in accordance with applicable requirements, such as local land use and zoning requirements in the proposed project area, and would incorporate appropriate control technologies and best management practices. So that's directly from the regulations.
Perfect. Yeah, that's super helpful for the solar projects. And then finally, will each OCEED project need to go through its very own NEPA analysis, or will some projects be excluded from the NEPA trigger? And who will be the lead agency under the NEPA reviews?
Great question. So all projects would be receiving financial assistance from DOE and subject to NEPA. As mentioned earlier, financial assistance is considered a major federal action subject to NEPA. Of NEPA review, so CX, EA, or EIS required for your project will depend on the specific details of your proposed project. And lastly, DOE would be the lead agency for NEPA reviews.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you so much, Gretchen, for answering
Yeah, of course.
those frequently asked questions. We try to kind of cover that content so that we can kind of address some of these questions that we're thinking are on a lot of people's minds. At this time, I'm going to hand things back over to Jillian with DOE.
Thanks so much, Gail. Could we switch to the next slide, please? One more slide, thanks. Awesome. So thanks so much to our speakers today and for everyone who joined us. Sorry, we'll go back just a second to Q&A. I think we'll have Logan will, if you want to turn your camera on and mute, I think we have a few more questions that we're going to be able to answer. So if you could shift the slides back to Q&A and then Logan.
Oh, hey, everyone. Yeah, there was a question here for a project on private mine land. What level of NEPA would be expected for the grant award? I'll say that on private mine land, OSMRE might not actually be involved, kind of depending on mainly depending on whether or not any federal mineral, coal, would be impacted. But generally, if it's on private mine land, I think what you're looking at is trying to figure out which federal agencies would need to be involved based on different permits, and then as far as the actual level of NEPA analysis, nearly impossible to answer at this point. So if for some reason Army Corps of Engineers needed to have some permitting work for a particular project on private mine land, the actual scale or the level of the NEPA analysis would be kind of determined by working with that agency. So just because it's on private mine land does not necessarily preclude any certain level of NEPA analysis. I mean, that unfortunately, it may limit the number of agencies involved if you don't have federal surface or federal mineral, but the actual level of the NEPA analysis really doesn't come into play as far as private or federal surface. So hopefully that answered that to a degree.
Thanks so much, Logan. And I think Gretchen will be able to answer one more as well.
Yes. So the question was, is there a template or example of a well-done EA specific to OCEED related requirements? So a great resource for that would be our website, energy.gov/NEPA, and there will be a lot of examples of well-done NEPA documents, including categorical exclusions, environmental assessments, and environmental impact statements. So I would direct you to our energy.gov/NEPA website.
Thanks so much, Gretchen. Okay, now we can go back to the concluding remarks slide, or the next one. Awesome. Well, thank you so much to all our speakers today and for everyone who joined us. This was the second webinar in the Clean Energy on Mainland webinar series. We currently have one more webinar scheduled, and we'll be scheduling more in the future, so keep an eye out for those. We do hope you will join us on July 12th for our next webinar on environmental liability associated with developing clean energy on Mainland, which will be presented by our colleagues at the EPA. And we encourage you to sign up for OCEED's newsletters to stay up to date on upcoming webinars and all other OCEED news. Thanks so much for joining and have a great day.